Thorn paced in a wide circle around the base of Willa's treehouse to the point where he was wearing a rut in the grass. Lily peered down at him now and then during the past few hours, wishing there was something she could say to put Thorn at ease. Truth be told, Lily was just as nervous, waiting for word from Willa regarding her passage. Lily filled 2 cups with water, stepped through the iris onto the oak branch and descended to the base of the tree just in time to meet Thorn as he completed his latest lap. "You sure you wouldn't rather wait inside?" Lily said as she offered him a cup. He stopped and took a sip. "Thank you, Mother Hillycrissing, but I'm Hickory," Thorn replied. "I've asked you to call me Lily." "My father would think it impolite," Thorn said. Lily sat on one of the large, twisted tree roots, felt the cool grass between her toes and allowed her concerns to float away on the gentle, afternoon breeze. She gestured to another large root across from her. "Please join me." Thorn hesitated and forced himself to sit. Lily gathered her thoughts, but noticed Thorn's legs bouncing with nervous energy. Thorn caught her glance, crossed his legs to quiet them and took another sip, self-conscious. "Do you mind if I ask you a question about your father?" Lily asked. Thorn would have preferred any other question but nodded rather than rebuffing Willa's mother. "What was the last thing your father said to you before he left?" Lily asked. The question took Thorn by surprise. He'd tried to push that memory from his mind, but Lily's inquiry pulled his thoughts back to that day at the spaceport over a year ago. He swallowed the lump in his throat and took a deep breath. "He had the fizzies about the expedition to the Orion sector," Thorn began. "The region's still mostly unexplored. He said there were reports about an anomaly he wanted to investigate. Something about how it might prove certain theories of space and time." Thorn hoped that would satisfy Lily. "Go on," Lily prompted. Thorn struggled through the pain. "I was worried because he'd never traveled that far from Earth before. He told me, never be afraid to explore the unknown because that's where all the secrets live. But I think the real reason he went out there was to search for Mother. 3 years ago, his mother, Celandine Ashgrove, had been on a diplomatic mission to the planet Shan, a new member of the Interstellar Alliance, when her ship, the Phoenix, mysteriously disappeared with all hands before reaching their destination. There were dozens of confusing and contradictory stories about Celandine's fate after she vanished. One said she had gone undercover on a covert mission for the Contact Council, a rumor they adamantly denied. Another tale emerged that the alien inhabitants of Shan had hijacked the Phoenix for some clandestine purpose, which their government also denied, and an even more unlikely theory was proposed that Celandine's ship had unknowingly passed too close to a recently formed black hole and been caught in the gravitational prison of its event horizon. Thorn couldn't bring himself to believe that any of the rumors were true, but was at a loss to explain his mother's absence. Now that he and his brother had been orphaned by the disappearance of their father, Thorn was just as likely to feel that a family curse was as good a theory as any. Lily felt a pang of empathy for Thorn and Rowan and began to regret opening the old wound. She sat quietly next to Thorn and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Thorn lowered his gaze to the ground. "I guess Willa's exploring something similar. I hope that," he trailed off as his throat caught. Lily gently lifted his chin until his moist eyes met hers. "Don't worry. Willa's a strong girl. She'll be fine." Thorn wiped his tears away. "Are you sure?" Rowan said. I mean, what if she becomes a wraith, or worse, a banshee? Rowan told you rumors. But even if that were the case, it wouldn't stop Willa. If there's one thing I know about my daughter, it's that she always follows her heart. Lily smiled at him. I've grown fond of you as well, she teased. Thorn managed a soft smile, slightly embarrassed. When do you think we'll hear from her? Passage is different for everyone. It could be minutes, hours, or even days. We must trust the timing, Lily said. Aren't you supposed to start your own training soon? Thorn hesitated, looked down at the ground. What is it? Lily pressed. Rowan said. Maybe it's not my path, Thorn admitted. Lily understood. You wanted to be with Willa. Thorn nodded, eyes still downcast. Yes, but... Lily laid her hand on his shoulder. She's not the only reason you want to become an initiate. Your mother, and now your father, both missing in space, your brother following in their footsteps, hopefully not literally. You feel safer on the ground, don't you? Thorn wiped at his tears. But what if Willa wants something? Someone besides me? Sages may be able to manipulate time and space, but no one knows for sure what the future will bring, Lily said. Give Willa some time to figure out who she is and what she wants. Lily took a sip from her cup to help her think. She took Thorn's cup and set it next to her. Hold out your hands and make fists, she told Thorn. He frowned, puzzled, but obeyed. Lily poured some of her water onto his hands. It dribbled onto the ground. Now open and cup your hands together, she instructed. Thorn did so and Lily poured water into his cupped hands. Drink, Lily said. Thorn sipped some of the water. What have you learned? She said. That it's easier to drink from a cup. Lily laughed. Love is like water. You can only hold onto it if you don't squeeze too tight. And if I open my hands too far? He spread his palms and the water poured onto the ground. Lily glanced down at the puddle. Well, it's a balancing act. Thorn sighed. Thanks, Mother Hilly. Lily. I feel better. Sort of. She patted his hand. You think I did this for you? I'm shaky as a willow in a wildfire. They both laughed. Lily stood. All that pacing, you must be hungry. Thorn suddenly realized he was starving and nodded. I have fresh berries. Thorn smiled, followed Lily up the winding branch into the nest and hoped that, with her mouth full of berries, she wouldn't ask any more questions about his father or mother. Chapter 4. Shards. Information is like water or electricity. It will flow along the path of least resistance, through whatever opening it can find. The Book of Paradox, by Sassafras the Sage. Willa stood on an endless plane of deep blue light suspended in an infinite black void. She slowly turned in a circle. The view was the same in all directions, except for a tiny glint of white on the horizon that slowly grew larger. Willa squinted to bring the object into focus. It resolved into a clear crystal sphere rolling toward her on the plane of light. Willa found it difficult to judge size and distance in the abstract landscape but, as the sphere came closer, it quickly grew to the size of a mountain. She turned and ran, the sphere closing on her by the second. Now the size of a small moon, it filled the horizon. Willa ran, legs straining, her heart threatening to burst. As the crystal sphere bore down on her, Willa opened her mouth to scream but it engulfed her before she could let out a sound. Inside the sphere, Willa floated in a liquid thick as honey. She drifted toward the center of the titanic orb, open-mouthed, suspended in a silent scream. Her heart pounded in her ears and sent ripples from her chest through the liquid. She fought through the terror, called upon every ounce of willpower and broke the deafening silence with a scream born in the depths of her soul. The sound froze the crystalline liquid. Enormous cracks raced through the sphere from its heart to the outer edge at the speed of light. The sphere's interior shattered into billions of shards, each a prismatic rainbow, brilliant as a diamond. The shards spun and twisted around Willa as she tumbled through them like a ghost. Thousands of crystalline inclusions reflected her image like an infinite hall of mirrors. Slowly, Willa began to notice that some facets showed her as a child, although it took her a few moments to realize that other shards revealed how she might look several years in the future. Fear was replaced by fascination as Willa floated through the fractures, absorbed by the tableaus that filled the shards. Scenes from her life paraded before her eyes along with images of people she knew but also many she didn't. Thorn was reflected in dozens of shards, like secret windows into private moments in his life, past and future, as well as scenes with his brother Rowan, his father Cale and several with Willa. Even their clandestine trysts among the trees at Three Rock were reflected back to her in a shard. She was surprised to find she didn't react with embarrassment as the intimate exchange of their first, passionate kiss played out before her, but felt the promise of love between them as a sweet and precious thing, like the blooming of a flower at first light. Willa's life continued to unfold in the shards. Glimpses of her as a baby in her mother's arms, the discovery of how soothing the cool water in a stream felt on her bare feet when she was 3, her father chasing and tickling her around the tree that supported the nest. Emotions ran deeply through Willa as she relived the memories, feeling them as though for the first time. The warmth of those moments abruptly evaporated as other shards came into view. Her attention was drawn to one razor-sharp shard that displayed Willa a few years hence, her body lying in the dirt, battered, bruised and bloody, with a tall, cadaverous grey alien with pale eyes clad in titanium armor standing over her in triumph as Port Dublin burned to the ground around her. Willa was aghast but had little time to absorb what she was seeing as another shard tumbled into view. She saw the face of Cale Ashgrove, Thorn's father. Her spectral body turned ice-cold as she witnessed Cale being brutally tortured by the tall, grey alien. As Cale screamed in agony, the shard shattered into smaller fragments with a loud crack, piercing Willa's ghostly form like shrapnel. She gasped in pain and dissolved in a blinding flash of light. Willa blinked, disoriented, as she found herself back in the great room with Holly and Argus standing outside the circle, peering down at her. She tried to stand but her legs folded under her. Argus caught her arm and gently lifted her off her feet. Willa not stand, Argus give hand. The Sasquatch carried her over to the hearth, leaned her against the wall and rubbed the stiffness from her thighs. She nodded her thanks then frowned as she glanced outside through the entry doorway. It was night and the Marrowbone Bridge was lit by the warm glow of dozens of floating luminaria. Willa looked at Holly. "How long?" "Several hours," Holly said. "Do you remember your name?" "What?" "Of course." "What is it?" Holly asked. Willa stared at Holly, her mind a blank. It's... Willa, she finally managed to blurt, puzzled by her faulty memory. "Thank the ancestors," Holly said, relieved. Sometimes, the Divinorum can shatter one's identity, especially after being immersed in its thrall for so long. "Can you remember what you saw?" Willa closed her eyes in concentration. It was like trying to recall a dream already beginning to fade. Her eyes snapped open as a memory flooded back into her mind. Cale. Cale? Cale Ashgrove, Thorn's father, I saw him in a dark place. He was being. Willa's voice abandoned her as an overwhelming sense of dread permeated her senses. She ran out the door and threw up over the side of the bridge. Holly went out and stood beside her, rubbed Willa's back until the heaving stopped. She carefully led Willa back inside the lodge, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. Argus brought a small stool from the anteroom, set it in front of the fire with a deep booming chuckle. Willa scowled at Argus as Holly lowered her onto the stool. "This is funny to you?" The Sasquatch nodded his huge, shaggy head and offered her a dipper of cool water. "Big funny. Willa looks like ghost." Willa drank the water, stared into the fire and slowly regained her composure. Holly sat on the floor next to her. "You saw Kale. Are you saying Thorn's father is alive?" Willa blinked, caught off guard. "Are you saying the vision was real?" "It's possible. The Divinorum collapses time and space, sometimes allows one to see farther than usual." "What did you see exactly?" Willa thought back. "I saw him being held against his will. Tortured for information. Somehow, I could hear his thoughts, feel his pain, his despair, like they were my own." "Did you see where he is?" Holly prodded. Willa searched her memory in vain. It was a dark place. It could be anywhere. I didn't recognize the alien who interrogated him. He was tall and lean, with gray skin and pale eyes. But even through his pain, Master Ashgrove thought of Thorn and Rowan, of all of us. Willa looked up at Holly, her eyes haunted. Holly knew Willa well enough to read her expression. "What aren't you saying?" Willa swallowed the fear that rose in her throat like bile. "I caught a brief glimpse of the alien's thoughts, too." She locked eyes with Holly. "Earth isn't safe." Kale was unceremoniously tossed into a gray stone cell by a thick, muscled guard wearing black body armor stamped with a red prison insignia of 2 interlocking diamonds. The guard slammed the heavy steel door shut, slid the deadbolt in place and left. Bruised and bleeding on the cold stone floor, Kale could hear the guard's heavy bootsteps grow fainter, followed by the sound of a second door being locked in place at the end of the hall. Panting with effort and grimacing from the pain, one arm wrapped around his aching ribs, Kale dragged himself across the floor and propped his back against the closest wall. He gingerly felt the newest crop of bloody welts on his once handsome face. Kept in solitary for weeks since his capture, he hadn't been allowed to see or speak to any of his crew and had no idea if they were dead or alive. He had tried to resist his captor's cruel interrogation, but the Orion extraction probe siphoned information from his brain as efficiently as a needle drawing blood. Once his torturers believed he had no more secrets to spill, Kale was certain his own life would be forfeit. Kale knew that no one from Earth could mount a rescue because the anomaly that damaged his ship had thrown it completely off course and fried the locator beacon. No matter. He'd long since made peace with his fate. His one regret was that he'd left Rowan and Thorn alone. It tore at him that he might never see them again, that they'd now be orphans and would never know what happened to their father. There was always a slim chance that a seer or a sage would divine his circumstance and pass the knowledge on to his sons, he thought. As awful as news of his torture and death might be, it would at least provide them with some sense of closure. The squeal of rusty door hinges drew Kale's attention to the hall outside his cell. The guard's heavy footsteps approached his door. A small slot opened near the floor and Kale's daily bowl of weak broth was shoved through the opening. Kale stared at the bowl and wondered if it was worth the effort to crawl across the floor for the meager meal, knowing it might be his last. The slot snapped shut, followed by a loud crack and a muffled thud as something heavy hit the floor outside the cell door. A rivulet of crimson blood flowed under the slot into the cell and pooled at the base of the bowl. Kale wondered if he was hallucinating from the stress of the interrogation and lack of food. The sharp sound of the deadbolt sliding back brought his attention into focus. The door swung open, framing the silhouette of a tall figure in black body armor. The guard was laid out on the floor outside the door, his head a bloody mess. Dennick flashed a smile and hurried over to Kale. "This is your lucky day." "Who are you?" Kale said. "Your rescuer," Dennick said, his smile fading. "You can't be from Earth." "Where?" Dennick said as he gently but quickly pulled Kale to his feet, causing him to clench his teeth and grunt in pain. Dennick shouldered his weight. "Pretend you have trouble walking." "Who's pretending?" Kale managed in a dry rasp. "Right. Sorry," Dennick said. "Let's get you out of here." "What about my crew?" "It took me an hour just to find you. I have no idea where they are." They made for the door and ambled down the hall. "Who are you?" said Kale more emphatically. "I'll answer all your questions if we get out of here." "When we get out," Kale corrected. "They beat you almost to death and you're still an optimist?" "If I was a pessimist," Kale said, "I'd already be dead." They turned a corner and were greeted by two more guards lying on the floor in pools of blood. One of them, about Dennick's size, wore only a skin-tight undergarment. "You killed them?" Kale asked, aghast. Dennick eyed him as though he might not have all his senses. "Wouldn't be much of a rescue if they woke up and sounded an alarm. Besides, I needed a disguise." They rounded another corner and stopped. This time, a pair of burly guards were very much alive. "Where are you taking that prisoner?" the ugly guard demanded in a voice like gravel. "Interrogation chamber," Dennick said as officially as he could. "It's the other way," said the uglier guard. "New here," Dennick griped. "Still get turned around in this maze." Without warning, he shoved Kale into the guard's arms. "You know the way, you take him." With the guards off balance holding Kale's dead weight, Dennick drew a long, slender, black-bladed dagger and skewered both guards through their eyes into their brains with lightning speed. He sheathed the blade and caught Kale before either guard hit the floor. Kale regarded Dennick with disbelief as they continued down the hall. "Who are you?" Dennick's smile only enhanced the dangerous glint in his eye. "Keep quiet." "We're close," Dennick whispered. "To what?" Kale asked under his breath. They turned a final corner and stopped. "To that," Dennick replied. If there had been any food in Kale's stomach, he might have lost it. A steel trussed warehouse stretched before them, filled with pallets heaped with hundreds of decaying corpses. The pallets moved on conveyor tracks to the far end of the cavernous chamber where they dumped the bodies into an enormous vat of chemicals. The stench was overwhelming. Dennick steadied Kale, pulled two breather masks from a pack wrapped around his thigh. He placed one over Kale's nose and fixed the other to his own face. Kale began to recover. "What is this?" "There was an uprising in Red Sector 5, Dennick explained. It didn't end well. The overlords extract the tracker implants, then process the bodies for the nutrients." Kale blanched. "Nutrients?" "They're rendered into food for the splicers." "The what?" "Genetically engineered beings, only partially sentient, used as slaves and soldiers," Dennick said with disgust. "One of the many reasons we're at war with the overlords." Dennick pointed to a low catwalk over the chemical vat. "You think you're strong enough to grab onto that?" "Maybe, but the only way over there is." Before Kale could finish his protest, Dennick pushed him off the ledge onto a pile of rotting bodies as the pallet passed by, then jumped down after him. Fortunately, the entire operation is automated, Dennick said as though giving a tour. No one comes down here if they can help it. Cale was too busy retching bile into his mask to hear a word Dennick said. He ripped it off, tried to catch his breath and nearly passed out from the reeking effluvium. Dennick yanked Cale to his feet as they approached the catwalk. Get ready. Cale squinted at the steel catwalk through watery eyes, flexed his fingers to test their grip. I'll climb on, then pull you up. You just need to hold on for a few seconds, Dennick said. Cale nodded and felt a surge of adrenaline at the thought he might see his sons again. The pallet passed under the catwalk. Cale and Dennick gripped the lip. Dennick pulled himself up and over the railing, braced his shoulder against a stanchion and grabbed Cale's hands. He strained against the weight as Cale reached for the railing and slipped from Dennick's grasp. Cale landed on top of several decomposing corpses with a sickening squish. The pallet passed under the catwalk as Dennick rushed to the opposite side. Cale summoned every last ounce of strength, scrambled to his feet amid a mess of bones and entrails, reached up and clasped Dennick's outstretched hand. He held on for dear life as the pallet fell away, plunging its grisly cargo into the seething chemical soup. Dennick pulled Cale onto the catwalk, nearly dislocating his shoulder. They lay on the catwalk grating to catch their breaths until an alarm screamed in their ears. I guess they noticed you're missing, said Dennick as he urged Cale to his feet. They hurried down the catwalk to a service port. Dennick turned the tumblers, unlocked the hatch and pushed it open. They crouched and stepped through onto an outside catwalk that hugged the sheer precipice of the steel citadel wall several stories above ground. Cale inhaled the cool night air like it was a perfumed elixir. Dennick shut the hatch and they made their way along the narrow catwalk. Now what? Cale asked. Now we jump, Dennick replied. Cale peered over the railing at the grid of grey stone dwellings that surrounded the citadel 100 feet below. I can't tell if you're joking. Dennick flashed a roguish smile. This is no time for jokes, my friend. Dennick pulled two small curved pieces of metal from his pack, gave them a shake. They telescoped into silvery rings about 3 feet in diameter. He tapped a control on each ring. They snapped to horizontal positions in mid-air. Each ring emitted a soft hum along with a faint blue aura. Grab on. Dennick handed one ring to Cale, held his overhead to demonstrate. Cale followed suit, puzzled as to the ring's function. Dennick sat on the railing, swung his legs over and jumped. Cale watched as his rescuer floated down 10 stories and landed on the rooftop of one of the stone buildings gently as a leaf. Dennick motioned for Cale to follow. Cale tested his grip on the ring and, at the muffled sound of heavy boots on metal from inside the citadel, he let himself fall over the edge. As Cale drifted downward, Dennick rapped on a large trap door set into the roof. It slid open just in time for Cale to drift inside. Dennick jumped down after him and the trap door slid shut seconds before a pack of armored guards burst out onto the catwalk. They quickly dismissed the precarious perch as an escape route and ducked back inside the citadel in search of their prey. Chapter 5. The Quorum of Nine. When hybrids were first created, most had no understanding of individual initiative since all hybrids at the time were raised on ships by the Whelks, or the Greys, as they used to be known, a hive-minded society without emotion that lived by a rigid set of rules, similar to selfless workers in an ant colony who all take their instruction from a single queen. When it became necessary for hybrids to live on Earth among humans, they had to be trained to think and feel as individuals. This was no easy task since the concept, if you'll pardon the pun, was completely alien to them. After many decades, hybrids finally experienced the awakening, and were able to take their place in the rich, emotional tapestry of human society. However, the great irony was that, while most hybrids retain some hive mind attributes, such as sporadic experiences of telepathy, their burgeoning individuality often made it quite challenging to achieve consensus. Thus, it became necessary for them to create smaller groups to oversee the interests of the hybrid population around the world. This gave rise to the local quorums that report to the First Contact Council, which in turn reports to Earth's representatives within the Interstellar Alliance. Excerpt from A Hybrid History by Holly Cotton. Willa was still in a daze as the effects of the divinorum slowly faded. The Celtic circle she sat in during her vision had been raised to form a table and chairs in the center of the great room. She sat at the table across from the entrance, watching Holly greet several other members of the quorum who had been summoned to this late-night meeting. There were two other cryptics like Holly, rail-thin identical twins named Rose and Lilac Larkspur, both with large, expressive pink eyes and clothing colored to match their names. Their semi-glazed expressions gave Willa the impression that the twins lived in a world of their own and were only temporarily visiting this one. Two nocturnals, Selene Nymphaea and Eridani Ginkgo, distinguishable by their unnerving, all-black eyes, sat stiffly in their dark robes. Eridani appeared placid as a statue, but Selene looked as though the lodge was the last place she wanted to be. There were even a couple of shapeshifters named Encantado and Moshi, whose skins were in a constant state of flux, subtly changing color and texture as though they couldn't decide who or what they wanted to be. Shapeshifters often adopted single names as an ironic counterpoint to their constantly shifting identities. Argus simply nodded and grunted to each guest as they took their places around the large table. The Sasquatch remained standing near the hearth, his keen eyes focused on Willa. Holly cleared her throat and, after a moment, Willa realized she was the subject of everyone's attention. She sat up straighter. "This is Willa Hillycrissing, my apprentice and a recent divinorum initiate," Holly said with a hint of pride. "Willa, this is the Northern Quorum of 9. She glanced at an empty seat. "Or at least, most of it," she added. Selene huffed with mild derision. "That's hardly surprising. Sages don't know the meaning of time." "True," a silvery voice said from just outside the doorway. "But we do understand the importance of timing." Everyone turned toward Alder Redwood, an impossibly thin man whose warm, cinnamon skin was complemented by honey-colored eyes similar to Willa's. His lean frame was dressed in anachronistic finery. A crisp, white high-collared shirt was wrapped in a tailored vest of champagne silk under a velvet black Victorian half-coat. High-waisted black pants fell over ebony boots capped with oxblood spats. Alder took his seat and propped his boots on the tabletop. "So, what's all the fuss?" Selene bristled at Alder's impertinent posture and even Argus scowled at the haughty sage. Alder paid them no mind. Holly held Alder's gaze. Willa saw the shards. The reactions around the table ranged from astonishment to disbelief, except for Alder, who regarded Willa with fascination. "You said she's only an initiate," Selene sniffed, as if that proved the impossibility of such a notion. Nevertheless, Holly assured her, she has, and what she saw doesn't bode well for the world. Alder leaned forward, enthralled. "Please, do tell." Willa fidgeted in the spotlight of the sage's attention. There was something simultaneously mesmerizing and dangerous about him, like gazing at a breathtaking sunset while standing an inch from the edge of a sheer cliff. She glanced at Holly, her one anchor of safety. Holly's reassuring smile coaxed Willa from her apprehension. I saw my friend's father, Cale Ashgrove, being questioned. Tortured? By aliens somewhere. In the Orion sector, I think, Willa said, the pieces slowly falling together in her mind. I not only heard Cale's thoughts but theirs as well. They forced him to talk about Earth and it feels like they're planning. I'm not sure, but maybe something like an invasion. The silence was absolute as the vacuum of space. As usual, Celine was the first to break it. This is utter nonsense. No initiate, even a very gifted one, has ever seen the shards in their first passage. True, said Alder, I took the Divinorum 3 times before I saw them, and then only faintly at first. I rest my case, Celine said. However, Alder said, leaning in closer to Willa, I sense something of the Anu in her. I believe she may have the mark. The astonishment of the quorum at Willa's ability to see the shards was nothing compared to the shock on everyone's face, including Argus's, at Alder's proclamation. Willa's mouth went dry as she forced a question from her lips. Forgive me, but, can someone please tell me what the shards are and what mark he's talking about? Willa. Holly's gentle voice was a soothing balm to Willa's fear. Long ago, before the landing, the people of Earth referred to the creation of the cosmos as the Big Bang. Now we think of it as less of a bang and more of a shatter. What's the difference? Allow me, Adler said. Holly graciously yielded to the eccentric sage. He pulled a small round mirror from a pocket in his half-coat and laid it on the table. A bang means something, some infinitely small thing exploded outward, expanded into the universe we know. But space, more specifically distance, as we perceive it are illusions. That primordial particle didn't really explode outward. Alder brought his fist down on the mirror, startling Willa as it shattered. It simply shattered into an infinite number of pieces. The universe is still as small as it ever was and everyone and everything in it are the shards. And the mark? Willa prompted. Not the mark, Alder corrected as if his emphasis could make Willa see the capital letter. Willa frowned. I don't understand. Holly took over. It's a genetic marker in your blood. You already know that many of the early hominids that naturally evolved on Earth were genetically altered hundreds of thousands of years ago by a spacefaring race called the Anu who, by adding their own genes to the mix, created Homo sapiens. Humans, Holly began, and, of course, there's the creation of our various hybrid races from human and whelk DNA, who used to be known as the Greys. When hybrids began to mingle with humans after the landing, it added even more genetic markers to the mix. What you may not know is that, despite the addition, dilution and mix of genes, a very small percentage of Earth's population still possesses an original, nearly unaltered gene from the Anu race. Alder is saying that you're one of them, Willa. That's why I saw the shards on my first try? Exactly, said Alder. I dare say you'd make a formidable sage. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Celine reminded him with authority. She's not even a cryptic yet. Yes, of course, Celine, Holly answered respectfully. I'll see to it she continues her training. Encantado's shape-shifting skin reflected his various moods as he absorbed the exchange. But what of this invasion she saw? What are we to do about that? He turned his black eyes on Willa. She felt her skin crawl and instantly understood what Poppy meant when she said shapeshifters gave her the creeps. You need to learn more. When will it happen and how? She needs to rest before imbibing more Divinorum, Holly interjected. You know the rules. Encantado kept his brooding eyes on Willa as though she might disappear any moment. It seems some rules are made to be broken. I suggest we adjourn for now and meet again when we have more information, Holly said. The others nodded their agreement, encantado more curtly than the rest and, except for Alder, rose and departed without another word. Celine, the last to leave, gave Willa an enigmatic glance, then stepped out into the night. If you don't mind, Alder said to Holly, I'd like to help with Willa's training. Argus grumbled deep in his throat. With your permission, of course, Argus, Alder quickly added. Argus's growl softened to a grudging grunt of acceptance. Cale woke from the deepest sleep he'd had since his capture. He looked around at the dank walls and rusty iron door of the cubicle that contained the simple cot on which he had slept and, for a frightening moment, it seemed as though he was back in his cell and that his rescue was just a dream. Then he remembered the arduous journey through dozens of nondescript apartments like this one, all linked together by a maze of secret tunnels and trapdoors built over the years by Dennick's underground resistance. The door creaked open and Alara entered with a tray of broth and cooked vegetables. Cale sat up on the edge of the cot. Oh good, you're awake, she said with a smile and set the tray on a simple side table. You need to build up your strength. We won't be able to stay here for long. I'm sorry, Cale said, did we meet? We did, but you were nearly comatose after my husband marched you through 3 miles of tunnels. I'm Alara. Cale Ashgrove. Thank you both for getting me out of there. Alara's mouth twitched with the briefest of smiles. What? Cale said, wondering what the joke was. It's nothing. I don't mean to sound unfeeling, but your rescue was necessary to our cause. Please eat, she said, handing him the broth. Cale slowly sipped and felt better almost immediately. What is this? It's made from oola, a root that still grows in remote locations on Zos. Its restorative powers are legendary. Zos? That's the name of your world? Alara nodded, though a deep sadness clouded her eyes. It hasn't been our world for a long time. Cale took a few more sips, tried one of the vegetables and found it plain but delicious. I have a lot of questions. As do we, Alara said. Shall we take turns? Where are we? Cale began. In the abandoned workers' cell blocks a few miles from the Archon Citadel, where you were held captive. Where are you from? I don't recognize your race. My world's called Earth, over 1,000 light-years from the Orion sector, Cale offered. Orion? That's what you call the Empire? My people know nothing of your empire. In fact, that's something I've been wondering ever since I had the misfortune to meet your Archon and his charming minions. How is it you speak my language? I was about to ask you the same thing, Alara said. Are you wearing some kind of translator? No. You? Alara shook her head. I guess that will have to remain a mystery for now. Can you tell me what the Archon's interrogators learned from you? Just about everything, I'm afraid. Our technology, the location of Earth. They've probably disassembled my ship by now. I assume they extracted information from my crew as well. How many? Alara asked, concerned. 25. That's a lot of intel, Alara said. Cale locked his gray eyes on her. They're people, not intel. I'm sorry, of course, I didn't mean. It's just that we've been fighting the overlords for generations. Anything that might give them a greater edge could mean the annihilation of the League. Of my family and friends. What about my crew? Cale said. We need to go back and rescue them. We can't risk it. They've doubled the guards by now and they'll still be searching for us. Cale put the empty bowl back on the tray. I understand. Alara nodded and stood. Our transport will arrive just before daybreak. Please rest until then. Alara closed the rusty door behind her. Kale lay back down on the cot and, as he drifted off to sleep, his thoughts turned to deep concern for Rowan, Thorn and the fate of Earth. Chapter 6. Archon. Disobedience is death. The first decree of Zos Asura. Supreme Archon of the Empire. Zos Asura sat in the heavy iron chair in the execution chamber and watched with detachment as the executioner and his assistants, dressed in traditional red robes, strapped 3 prison guards face upward onto metal planks cantilevered out from a thick, steel scaffold. There was a hole in each plank, directly between each guard's shoulder blades, that matched the position of 3 tapered steel spikes that jutted from the scaffold's lower crossbeam. 2 of the 3 guards stoically accepted their punishment while the third struggled against his restraints. Great Zos Asura. Spare my life so that I may continue to serve. But you've failed to serve me, Gant, the Archon said without emotion, and second chances are costly. He glanced at the other 2 guards. Either of you have any secrets to sell? Given an unexpected chance at life, the guard on the far plank desperately searched his memory. The captain of the guard skims from our pay. Zos Asura allowed a faint smile to crack his cadaverous face. Of course he does. He's the captain. The Archon gave a subtle nod to the executioner. He pulled a lever and the guard's plank swung downward. The steel spike punched through the guard's spine and heart, killing him instantly. His blood ran into a gutter under the scaffold and coursed through a pipe that led to the processing chamber. The Archon's gaze shifted to the guard on the center plank. Anything you'd like to share? My lord, it wasn't my fault the prisoner escaped. No? Zos Asura responded with raised eyebrows. Should I blame the guards who are already dead? No, my lord, I simply meant. The Archon flicked his hand at the executioner and the center guard fell to his death with a deafening clang of steel on steel, adding his blood to the gore below. And you, Gant, the Archon said, sounding bored, what do you have to say? A member of the League is loyal to me, my lord, Gant said quickly. The Archon's interest was piqued. Why haven't you told me this before? I feared this moment might come, the guard admitted. The Archon nodded. Now here was someone useful. You're more clever than I thought. At a gesture from the Archon, the executioner freed Gant from his bonds. The guard rushed down the stairs and dropped to one knee before Zos Asura, his head bowed. Thank you, my lord. You are most merciful. I spare your life and you repay me with an insult? Gant grovelled at the Archon's feet. No, my lord. I meant no disrespect. Mercy is weakness. Forgive me. Who's your spy in the Resistance? My brother. The Archon frowned. Wasn't he banished to the Outlands by Overlord Vorga? Part of Vorga's plan to lure the League into recruiting him, my lord. The Archon's eyes flashed in anger and Gant feared he might wind up back on the plank for delivering the unwelcome news that one of the overlords had not informed Zos Asura of his plan. I shall have a talk with Vorga, the Archon promised. Perhaps we'll have a third execution after all. Yes, my lord, Gant exhaled, relieved. Gant knew if one of the overlords appeared more cunning than the Archon, the other overlords might shift their loyalty and foment a coup. The Archon's reaction was exactly what he'd hoped it would be. This tidbit of information was the least of the secrets Gant had collected about several other overlords over the years. He planned to dole them out slowly and make himself indispensable to the Archon. Only when Zo's Asura was convinced of his undying fealty would Gant make his move to assassinate the Archon and become absolute ruler of the Empire. "Father's alive?" Thorn cried. Thorn and Rowan sat around a table in the nest with Willa, Holly, Lily and Willa's father, River Hillycrising, a gentle man with a thoughtful face and the cinnamon hair he had bequeathed to Willa. Several bowls held the remnants of their evening meal. The shock of Willa's news slowly gave way to hope as Willa told them of her vision. He was alive in the vision, but he was also being tortured, Willa reluctantly admitted, hating herself for crushing the boy's newborn hopes. "I'll take the Divinorum again soon. See if I can learn more," she added quickly, trying to lessen the sting. "We've got to mount a rescue," Rowan insisted. "We don't know where Kale is," River reminded him. "Even if we did, we have no idea what we'd be up against." From Willa's description, Kale's captors are clearly aggressive, perhaps even warlike. They may have weapons we have no defense against. "We've got to do something," Thorn pleaded. "We will," Holly assured him, "but we need more information. I've asked the Quorum for help. Those who are willing will take the Divinorum. We'll find out everything we can and inform the Council and the Alliance." "But that could take days, weeks," Thorn protested. "By then, it could be too late." Willa rested her hand on Thorn's. "I swear on my soul I'll keep searching as long as it takes." Thorn squeezed her hand and nodded. Rowan was equally frustrated but realized there was nothing else they could do. He nodded his consent and rose from the table. "I'll brief my first contact instructors at the training center on Andromeda Spaceport. Maybe this can be resolved diplomatically." "Good idea," River said. "The people holding Kale might be willing to trade him back to us." "I wish I could believe that," Willa said, "but I got a very strong impression that they simply take what they want and kill anyone who stands in their way." She glanced at Thorn's stir-icon expression and immediately regretted her statement. "I'm sorry." Rowan clasped Thorn's shoulder. "Father's been in some tough situations. He's always managed to survive. We'll get him back, one way or another." He turned to Willa. "Thank you, Willa. You've given us hope." Thorn rose and gave Willa a huge hug. She was a tad uncomfortable with her parents and Holly watching, but she didn't let go until Thorn did. He joined his brother and they walked through the iris and down the branch. Willa turned to Holly. "How soon can I take the Divinorum again?" "The Quorum will gather at the lodge tomorrow morning. Until then, I suggest you get a lot of rest." Holly rose and gave Willa's parents a slight but respectful bow of her head. "Thank you for your hospitality and for entrusting your daughter to my care. She has a special talent." Willa blushed as her parents beamed at her. "For more than mischief, I hope," Lily said with a wink. Holly smiled and placed a gentle hand on Willa's shoulder as she passed. "I'll expect you at the lodge after morning meal. Good night." The iris closed behind her as she meandered down the oak branch. "I doubt I'll sleep a tick," Willa said. "I remember you always fell fast asleep when I read you bedtime stories," her father teased. "Father, I'm 13. "Right. Too old for stories then," River said as he stood and removed the bowls from the table. "She grows like a weed," he said to Lily in jest. Willa feigned exasperation. "Maybe if I get to choose the story." "Of course," River conceded. Willa pondered her choices. She glanced up at him, a crooked smile on her elfin face. "What mischief are you dreaming up in that foxy little head, Puka?" said Lily. "There's one story you would never tell me because I was too young," Willa said to her father. River's playful smile faded. He looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes and nodded. "River, are you sure?" Lily said. "It's time she was told," he said. "After all, she's 13. Chapter 6. The Banshee of Marrowbone Bridge. Banshees existed in human literature long before hybrids came to this world. But little is known about them beyond their function as harbingers of death. In this context, they are similar to other elemental beings, such as the one known as Mothman, who appears to be attracted to imminent death and disaster like a moth to a flame. This analogy may be more apt than first realized, as these entities inhabit a realm between life and death and may find themselves pulled, by ethereal energy currents, to the impending tunnel of light, so often reported by those who've had near-death experiences. Excerpt from The Quintessential Elemental, by Nightshade the Nocturnal. 300 years ago or so, a sage named Belladonna Bloodroot lived in a moss-encrusted stone cottage at the edge of a yew tree grove near the southern gate of Marrowbone Bridge. She was a mere slip of a woman with long, silver hair and indigo eyes set in a delicate, pale face. Belladonna frequently flitted to and fro in her gossamer robe among the denizens of Port Dublin as she went about her business, often stopping to chat with the flowers in a window box or a rosemary sprig in someone's garden. She was known far and wide for her mastery of herbal potions and her vast knowledge of the flora on Earth. There wasn't a flower, shrub, tree or growing plant she couldn't talk to or learn something from, and she would often spend her days holding court with elemental beings, such as pukas, sylphs and sprites in a fairy ring of mushrooms deep in the heart of the forest. In point of fact, it was those very elementals who taught her how to cultivate the special strain of divinorum used by cryptics, nocturnals and shapeshifters that aided them on the path toward becoming full-fledged sages. Belladonna's fellow Dubliners rarely spoke to her unless they needed a cure for some ailment, and most gave her no more thought than they would a warm breeze or a gentle summer rain, for who could understand the mysterious ways of a sage except another of her kind? This suited Belladonna just fine since she detested idle chatter. Besides, in her opinion, plants had much more interesting things to say than people, such as an ancient oak that had recently hinted there was yet another level of mastery beyond sage. This intrigued Belladonna and occupied her thoughts of late. After all, a sage could appear in any form, like a shapeshifter, but could also manifest objects seemingly out of thin air as well as shift the very fabric of space and time. What, she wondered, could lie beyond that? It struck Belladonna one day while in the middle of a conversation with a magnificent cedar in an old cemetery that, while she could shape the material world to her thoughts, the realm of spirit was beyond her reach. Of course, stories of interactions with all manner of spirits had been told for thousands of years on Earth, but those encounters always seemed one-sided, controlled by the incorporeal rather than by the living. Perhaps there was a way to bridge the two dimensions, Belladonna mused, to walk in both worlds while still alive. The old cedar, having lived its entire life in the graveyard, was keenly aware of the fates and fortunes of spirits, and it cautioned Belladonna against delving too deeply into the afterlife, since even the most powerful sage was fragile as wheat to the scythe of the Grim Reaper. But the notion caught fire in Belladonna's mind and she couldn't put it out. She spent the next 3 years consuming every morsel of information she could from the cedars, oaks, yews, other sages and all manner of elementals with any connection to the spirit world. Belladonna often toiled without sleep for days as she experimented with endless combinations of mushrooms, herbs, oils, flowers and natural essences until, with the help of a fellow sage named Rusalka, she finally concocted a special draft of divinorum she believed would be the doorway to the etheric plane between the realms of the living and the dead. But, obsessed as she was, Belladonna never sensed that Rusalka was, in fact, not a sage, but a trickster puka in disguise. Pukas, while often helpful, are also mischievous creatures. Rusalka resented that Belladonna was attempting to cross a threshold that could give her power over the elemental world, so he convinced the sage that her own namesake, the belladonna plant, also known as deadly nightshade, was an essential ingredient for her potion. The puka assured her that, in minute quantities, it would be safe. Belladonna drank the divinorum as she had done so many times before, but instead of drifting into the dreamlike altered state that called forth visions, or transmuting into a higher state of being, slivers of pain shot through her skull as though some invisible entity had stabbed red-hot needles into her brain. Belladonna writhed in agony on her cottage floor as violent spasms racked her slender body from head to toe. Her lungs heaved, her heart threatened to explode, and her stomach felt like it was being eaten alive by ravenous insects. Was she transforming into the mystical wraith she sought to become? Or had she made an error and stupidly poisoned herself? She let out a high-pitched wail that carried through the chill night air and sent shivers down the spines of all who heard it. Then, as quickly as it had started, the pain stopped. Belladonna laid on the floor, drained of life, her mind tumbling through a fog of confusion. Did it work? She was numb all over. She couldn't feel her hands or her legs, although they moved at her command. She slowly rose off the floor, but not because she stood up. Belladonna was shocked to find herself halfway between the floor and ceiling, a transparent, ghostly figure in diaphanous robes that undulated in the breeze like her long, silvery hair as though she was suspended in invisible liquid. Belladonna caught her reflection in a polished copper cauldron hanging from a hook over the kitchen chopping block. She let out a pitiful wail as she beheld the gaunt face and glowing eyes that marked her as a banshee, a spectral being doomed to wander the earth, an omen of impending death to all who would encounter her. She would forever be attracted like a moth to the brilliant, swirling tunnel of light that transported the newly deceased to the afterlife, yet be barred from entering the higher spiritual realms herself. Belladonna desperately called upon her abilities as a sage, a shapeshifter, a nocturnal, and even as a cryptic to undo the hideous transformation, but the powers it had taken a lifetime to learn had abandoned her. She was, quite literally, a ghost of her former self. She wailed grievously, a forlorn keening that resonated off the walls of her stone cottage, once a place of refuge that would now and forever serve as her crypt. Belladonna floated out a window, weightless as a fine mist. She drifted over the yew grove, then above the path that snaked toward Marrowbone Bridge. At this time of night, most of the locals were enjoying midnight meal or were fast asleep. Belladonna's soft keening drifted in through open windows as she passed by, head cast down in abject misery. Several people peered outside, caught sight of the wailing specter, and quickly closed their shutters and locked their doors. A black cat crossed the bridge. As soon as it spied the banshee, it hissed and hugged the far railing until Belladonna drifted past, oblivious to the animal's fear. As Belladonna approached the north end of the bridge, she sensed a familiar presence and raised her luminous eyes. Rusalka, still disguised as a fellow sage, stood on the path beyond the bridge. He transformed into his more common form, that of a red-eyed hare, his long rabbit ears swept back like horns. He rose on his haunches to his 4-foot height and flashed a wicked, buck-toothed smile. Belladonna flew into a rage at the sight of the impudent elemental. She let out a frightful wail and rushed at him headlong, her skeletal hands outstretched. But as she reached the end of the bridge, an unseen force held her back. She strained against the invisible barrier, yet Rusalka remained mere inches beyond her grasp. The puka laughed at Belladonna's frustrated fury. She screamed at him, demanded to know why he had done this to her. Rusalka threw back a quote from Shakespeare, a favorite scribe of elementals since the bard so often recounted tales of their kind in his poems and plays. In a wilderness where are no laws, to the rough beast that knows no gentle right, nor aught obeys but his foul appetite. Belladonna seethed at the jape, an admonition that she had intruded on a realm that wasn't hers and paid the price for her arrogance. The puka compounded her woes by declaring that the altered divinorum would confine her spirit to the terrain within a mile of her cottage, which meant she could never venture across Marrowbone Bridge to the lands of the north where Rusalka and his kind dwelled. Belladonna raged and wailed at her fate and, from that day on, swore vengeance upon Rusalka and all his kind. The puka turned and, with a flick of his furry tail, leapt off into the night. Faster than thought, the banshee returned to her cottage and began searching through her voluminous collection of esoteric lore for an antidote to the puka's spell, but after many months of scrutinizing every passage, every line, every recipe in her storehouse of potions, her search proved fruitless. Belladonna sulked and sobbed, alone in her cottage, and scared away all who came to seek her aid. The townspeople finally began to avoid the yew forest and, as months turned to years, the banshee's cottage was overgrown with vines and moss, and the yew tree next to the dwelling grew larger and larger, until it split the rocks of the north wall asunder. Now and then, over the course of many years, Belladonna would feel an overwhelming pull and she'd be forced to leave her moss-covered crypt to haunt the south end of Marrowbone Bridge. As befit the banshee's plight, her wails would herald an impending death in the village, either from sickness, accident or old age, for 3 days before the death actually occurred. Thus, the villagers were never welcoming of her presence and were always relieved when Belladonna would return to her forest cloister and cease her heartbreaking dirge. Legends of banshees have always assumed they keen for the dying and the dead, but in truth, being trapped forever between two worlds, it is for themselves that they wail. Chapter 8. Nocturnal. Dusk stretches forth fingers of darkness over the landscape of the living. As light dims and dies, heralding the night that cocoons all in its velvet embrace, the substance of shadows, thick with portent, unfathomable, until made tactile by time. Breath of rarefied air from the in-between realm, auguring omens that ring true in epitaphs, carved in cold, hard stone, forever freezing lives between brackets of measured time and fading memories. From Songs of the Night by Nightshade the Nocturnal. Willa rocked side to side in her hammock as her father finished Belladonna's tale. She still haunts the bridge after 300 years? So the story goes, River said, though the last time anyone saw her was 10 years ago when Laurel Larkspur died. I saw her daughters, Rose and Lilac, at the lodge. They seem unusual. Sadness whispered in River's reply. They've been through a lot. How did their mother die? River looked through Willa as the unpleasant memory bubbled up within him. Father? He shook his head and stood. I think one unhappy ending is enough for tonight. You were worried I might be scared if you told me Belladonna's story when I was younger. He nodded. I didn't want to deter you from your dream of becoming a sage, but you're old enough now to understand the risks. How many sages have gone on to become wraiths? No one knows, River said. Wraiths are elusive beings at the best of times. Willa pondered the story as River tapped the luminaria to dim the light. He kissed her on the forehead. Get some sleep, my brave girl. You've got a big day tomorrow. Father, what if I can't get more information? What if it was just a fluke? What if I can't do anything to save Thorn's father? Willa, River said, you'll do just fine. You heard what Holly said about your bloodline, our bloodline. You have a special gift.